Welcome back to another edition of Elevate Your Grind, brought to you by the Cannabis Lab. My name is Todd Rosales, and I am your host. Thank you for hanging in with us this week. We are still in Purgatory Week between Christmas and New Year's. If you're working, you may be one of the only people in the offices, or you may not even be paying attention to work. And of course, your boss is probably angry at you, but he's doing the exact same thing. Really excited for today's show. Always love talking to the investment groups in this space. It's where I actually came from. It's the reason I do the podcast. It's how I got access to so many different people. So really excited for today's guest. Of course, February 6th, everybody. I'm extremely excited. We're going to do the annual C-Lab conference. It's going to be down at the Sacred Space Miami, socially distant. I think we're going to have some food trucks there. Most of the MMTCs in Florida, if not all of them, will be in attendance. Will be socially distant. There will be an online component to it. So if you have joined us from another state and you've become a fan of C-Lab, we will make sure that we can include you. It will be virtual, but hey, you're used to that by now. So that'll be February 6th. You can check that out at joinclab.com. Of course, check out last week's episodes. We had Sam Ariano, we had Brooks Lustig of Seed & Smith, and then we also had Robert Beasley of Fluent. Three awesome conversations. Really appreciate everyone doing those. You can find those at youtube.com/cannabusinessgroup. But that is 100% wrong. I just combined our YouTube and Facebook pages. youtube.com/elevateyourgrind. Of course, anything we do live is right here at facebook.com/cannabusinessgroup. It is getting late. It is the end of the year. And obviously, folks, you can tell I'm a little confused myself. So instead of going through more announcements, let's just welcome our guest into the show. My guest today is managing a lot of money in this industry, right? And I've watched a few episodes. I've watched a few interviews he's done. I'm really excited to talk to him. Really excited to see where he sees opportunities going into 2021. I know that we looked at 2020 and kind of it was supposed to be a big year for M&A, and then the world shut down, right? So we're not sure if that's been delayed, if it just didn't happen the way that we wanted it to see. But I'm really excited with talk about, what he saw with companies adapting in 2020 and then what we expect for 2021 and so much more. So with that being said, please welcome Joe Cruthers, the CEO at Ceres Group Holdings. Joe, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me, Todd.
Absolutely, man. I'm very happy to have you. You are, it's funny. I've had this conversation with Cody Sanchez, with Morgan and Emily Paxia and everything else. And the one cool thing that I love about what you all are doing is you get to help shape what I think is going to be an industry that other industries are going to model themselves after in the future. And the reason I say that is because the entrepreneurs that are in this space have to face so many different roadblocks. There's so much regulation. There's just so much adversity that they need to overcome that's put in front of them from the regulatory bodies, that these entrepreneurs they're more nimble than others in other spaces. So I'm really excited to see people like you helping make that happen. That being said, I can imagine, and I'm sure you've been asked this question 100 times, when you're sitting in your office at Goldman Sachs, did you ever think that you would be one of the architects of the cannabis industry?
No, and neither did my parents, by the way. I think when I left Goldman to get into cannabis, the conversation I was the most fearful of was telling my mother I was going to get into cannabis. I was going to leave Wall Street and get into cannabis. And surprisingly, like probably most people in the industry, 3 years ago, a lot of times didn't talk about what I did because of the stigmas around it. Now, a lot of times I don't say what I do because it's all anyone will want to talk about with you for the rest of the night. So it is definitely, times have changed.
That's so funny that you say that. So we're coming up, we did our first episode on January 28th. And if you watch maybe the first 20, 30-ish episodes, I even on air hesitate about my own personal use and everything else. And now fast forward the other day, they're putting together these workout classes in my neighborhood. And my wife's like, she's like, oh, you should do it with everybody else. I'm like, I don't want to do it because I don't want them to friend me on Facebook. They're like, she's like, why not? I'm like, because then I'm just going to be the weed guy. She's like, yeah, but you love that. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, they're just going to talk to me about everything weed, and that's all I'm going to be to them. Can you get me this? What do you know about this? What do you know about that? So I've had that same journey going from being scared to talk about it to not wanting to talk about it because people will corner you at a party and talk your ear off, man.
They want to know what products you like, what you recommend, and yeah, that's right. It's your whole night.
Oh, and then on top of that, so clearly I'm not a registered financial advisor or I don't do investments or anything else anymore, but they start asking me about weed stocks. And I'm just like, don't you have someone that manages your money that can do that for you? I'm like, I can't even buy stock in the companies I want because I do my investment through Merrill Lynch and they won't let me do it. I remember I wanted to buy Trulieve and GTI and I
Tell
called
me you
up. I'm
did.
like,
Tell
hey,
me
it
you
won't
did.
let me.
I hope you did.
I,
I hope you
I
did.
I had to open account elsewhere. But Merrill's like, oh, it's federally illegal. You can't buy shares. I go, it's trading on a US exchange. What's wrong with you guys? So, but look at that. Hey, he hoped I did. I guess we won't call that investment advice. Of course we can't, but take it for what it's worth, folks. So what made you listen, everybody knows Goldman Sachs. It's a staple on Wall Street. It is, it's a launching pad for a lot of fund managers and everything else. What a From an entrepreneurial standpoint, what made you give up? I don't want to say a cushy job. I mean, I don't know where you were there, but from a Wall Street staple to A, go on your own, and then B, take that attention towards the cannabis space. I see it as a great place if you're going to do venture, if you're going to do PE, where the returns, higher risk, but definitely higher returns. But obviously, it is very risky. So, is this your first time being a manager in this space?
Well, we've been doing this now for a little over 3 years. So we've done 10, 12, I guess, deals now over that time period. So even though yes, we still feel very young, we are I guess we have some of the oldest, some of the grayest hair in the room, so to speak, in terms of legally investing in the space. But yeah, look, what got me into it, it was you've touched on a little bit of it, right? It's the opportunity and how good the opportunity looks. Also, there's not many places I think in life where you feel like you can do good and also make money doing it and be on the right side of history. And I really think we're in a place with cannabis. And I think, look, I still believe we're in the first inning of this game, right? If you will. I think a lot of folks feel like, wow, I've already missed my chance. It's already, everybody knows it's coming now. And so the secret's out. I think we are just really starting to scratch the surface. And I think you mentioned this earlier too. Things that are coming soon, this next year, things to focus on. I think we're going to get into a lot of that. We can do that on this show as well. But in the next year, 2, 3 years, you're going to see so many advances in the industry, and I just think we're going to look back and say, wow, these were really early stages. But I got into it really because I thought, look, there's not many times when you feel like you can do good work and you can make people money. And you can help an industry which needs that type of help, and it needs people that understand, that it's not all about bringing Wall Street to Mary Janeville, right? That's not how this should work. I think the right way to do this, frankly, is to get folks that have been in this industry and know it well, and partner and talk to people coming from other places, right? I think for us, that's been our real secret sauce, is that I'm working with a 20-year industry veteran that knows the space, knows where the bodies are buried. That stuff really is meaningful, I think, as an industry comes above ground and really evolves and changes. And for us, that's been a really big secret, I think, to our success.
Oh man, I'm not sure if you watched the show or not, man, but you're singing my tune here, right? So I work in the cannabis space, and a dirty word in this space is quote unquote corporate cannabis. But what I try to advocate for on this show is just because some of us here who might have used to wear suits to work and work on Wall Street and everything else, a lot of us were closeted advocates or closeted fans, right? And you're in a situation where you could lose your career or lose your livelihood or lose a license to operate and do the business that you want. I use Paul Rosen as an example, one of the founders of PharmaCann, who was, an attorney, and he would have been disbarred if he came out about his public use and everything else like that. So, I try when I talk to a lot of cannabis people. I had an awesome person on the show. Her name's Kristen Yoder. She's known as the cannabis BS detector, right? And we had this argument back and forth, and it was a great conversation. I say, there are a lot of us that were closeted that wanted to support this industry. We just couldn't at the time. I have a friend down here in Florida, who can't get his card or or be a supporter of the industry because he would lose a license that's associated with his career, right? So I try to dispel the stigma around corporate cannabis, if you will. And I personally think there's an advantage to doing it how you said. You're working with a 20-year industry vet. You bring the Wall Street side of things. He brings the cannabis side of things. I see that being a marriage made in heaven because, and I would love for you to comment on this. This industry is so regulated, and the access to capital is not there. At least traditional sources of capital. Capital is very restrictive. That you have to think outside the box, and you have to come up with outside the box deal structures and fundraising techniques and everything else, that it really takes someone with an intimate knowledge of Wall Street to do this right. And then you pair someone like that with a cannabis person, let them focus on the grow and the product and everything else. You let the other guy focus on the deals and the acquisitions and all that. And that is a match made in heaven for cannabis. Obviously, you and I are biased coming from one side of the fence, but what's your take on that?
I think that's exactly right. Look, you don't. I don't think it was a little. I think when the industry, call it 2016, right, 2017, when California came online. I think that was really. It's really when you sort of at first it was oil and water, right? It really felt like you were either a cannabis person and you hated the financial people, and you were used to the industry the way it was, and you didn't want to see those new folks come in, or you were one of the new folks coming in and you were looking at those guys and going, oh man, these guys are slow. I can run circles around. Like that was the attitude, right? And it very much was a little. And I think now what you're seeing were the success stories that you see, and a lot of them were sort of they either came about over time, or they were sort of forced on people. But I think there's a lot of good examples, right, of where you really do need both of those things. You need someone to come from outside and look at what's going on and say, okay, wait a minute. If we now structurally we have to do things differently. So here's ways to put some operational efficiencies, those things in place. Let's think about this as a business, right? And as a how to scale it, how to do all these fancy business terms, and how to do all that. But at the end of the day, we still grow cannabis. It's still it still spoils. It still has to travel. It's still all the same factors that have that the folks that have been in this industry for a very long time. And I still view as having the vast majority of the institutional knowledge that matters. I think you've got to marry those two things together if you want to give yourself a real chance to sort of see it, from to me with honest eyes that really know how much can a cultivation of X square feet kick out a year? What makes sense? How can you make products from flower? You've got to understand those things, I think, before you can really start doing what guys like you and I do, right? Which is take that and start putting it into models and making business sense of it. You still, at the end of the day, you've got to be able to grow cannabis. You got to be able to grow good cannabis for people. You got to be able to, then you've got to add all the business elements, but it still sits on that foundation. And I just think that's so important. And it's easy to forget and get very businessy and start just looking and burying yourself, in a spreadsheet. But at the end of the day, the real work is happening on farms and in stores with customers. And, I think we have to sort of remember that when we're sitting there in our spreadsheets, right? And I think that's both sides have to value the other piece.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And honestly, as someone who had come from a financial background, one of my favorite things is taking grow tours and talking to growers and understanding how they feel about their grow and the approach that they take. Is it an old school cannabis approach? Is it a pure botany approach? Is it a scientific approach? And it's so interesting to see the different methodologies that these growers will use. We had, I'd mentioned at the top of the show, Brooks Lustig from Seed and Smith on the show. And I remember going out there to talk to Seed and Smith, and they were growing the same amount of cannabis in their grow as another one I saw that was either a 60 or 80,000 square foot grow. And I had to ask him, like, how are you doing it? And he's telling me about the way that they have the lighting and the rooms and all this stuff. And it was so intriguing to me that, you kind of see that. And then on those conversations, you set your parameters for what you're looking for in other companies. And it's really cool that way. And I mean, listen, my first foray into finance was in real estate. And although it's a solid investment, it's boring to me. It's boring. It's buildings. You're going to buy that building cheap. You're going to sell it for more. You're going to buy this office park cheap. You're going to put some money into it. You're going to sell it for more. It's singles down the middle, but then you go and start doing grow tours and dispensary tours and everything else. And it's like, oh my God, this is a world of difference. So it's interesting to me, Ceres, you're getting a lot of attention for the SPAC right now, but that wasn't the first initial fund that you guys started doing deals with. It was, you had a private fund at first, correct?
Yeah, we still do. We have a private fund. In fact, we'll go out. We're actually launching our second fund now. So we have sort of two buckets that we invest from right now. One of them that we're targeting is from the Spac capital, and that's obviously a very different transaction than the sort of venture and growth stage, even later stage cannabis private investing. So in the Spac structure, we would basically be taking a company public on the Canadian market. Reason I say Canadian market is that we listed in Canada for the purpose of being able to target plant touching businesses here in the U.S. We just think there's a great opportunity there. Feel like a lot of capital is still needed there, and there's just obviously a lot of work to do, as evidenced by the elections and other things that are going on growth wise. So there's a need for capital there. It's still constrained, as you said. Cannabis has had a really rough go, I think, financially. It's been, we had sort of the path leading into COVID, and you referenced COVID earlier. Leading into COVID, it had been a really tight capital market already. The sources are very restricted. Obviously, the big institutional money from the United States can't play. So then you get into private money and smaller funds and those things, and it's just the larger checks are harder to come by, right? And so I think then you sort of had a really tight market there when you kind of had this excitement around cannabis for a year and a half, 2 years, and then everybody kind of thought, oh no, have we gotten out over our skis here? And then all of a sudden, COVID happens and people start to, I think, kind of believe again that, hey, this is an essential service. And there was a lot of good, probably long term, that'll come to cannabis out of the entire COVID event. Simply because it was deemed essential. I think that the budget shortfall, there's a lot of reasons that you're aware of, but I think it's going to turn out to be a very good event. And now you're starting to see capital markets open back up. So for us, we think it's a great time to be deploying capital. And for us, we're deploying out of the SPAC, and then we also have the private investment vehicle as well that we're still investing from also.
Again, completely uneducated opinion, but I agree with you. I think right now is a great time to kind of take a look and see where you want to deploy capital, because I think it's going to be a very interesting year in 2021. I think it's going to be a great year. And it's funny, I think I'm going to start circling back to the predictions that I made, because I remember when everything started shutting down, like a month in, when we were deemed essential, I kind of said, as weird as this time is, I feel like the cannabis industry was just released and it's on probation, and the whole world and the whole country's looking at us and they're saying, okay, what are you guys going to do with this? Are you going to operate correctly? Are you going to be safe? Are you going to use PPE and all that other stuff? Are you going to follow the rules and regulation? Or are we going to see a whole bunch of violations? Are we going to see people violating their licenses and everything else like that? And to me, we had the whole world looking at the cannabis industry, expecting it to fall on its face, and we didn't. We thrived. We were, where unfortunately you hear the narratives that businesses are shutting down, people are losing their jobs and everything else. Cannabis companies were growing and they were hiring people and they were expanding and they were moving into other states. And, I don't want to say COVID was a good thing for anyone, but I think it gave attention to the cannabis industry that it wouldn't have otherwise had, right? And really accelerated it, and kind of accelerated it from a stigma standpoint, where the stigma, I don't want to say was erased, but when you have, how many we have, 5, 6, 7 cannabis initiatives on the ballot, they all passed, it to me, that just shows that an unfortunate bet where they made us essential. It showed the world that this industry is here to stay, and it's the answer to a lot of problems. I'm curious, and this is obviously speculation, do you think we'd be where we are in this industry if we just operated 2020 normal, if there was no COVID, if we weren't deemed essential, if cannabis companies just had to continue to operate as they were?
No, look, I do think there are things that came about this year that really shed a light on certainly from an investment perspective, validated cannabis. I mean, would you sort of think about anti-cyclical, right? When the entire economy feels like it's retracting, and what does well in those environments, right? It's alcohol. In this case, you definitely see the alcohol. I think you've seen those numbers get hit a little bit, and I think you've seen cannabis numbers jump, but you see both of them do well in these types of environments. So it proves, a lot of that anti-cyclicality that I think is a very good thing, right? It's sort of a defensive sector. But look, I think regardless of COVID, the biggest thing to me that really happened, probably over, obviously legislation's a huge one. That continuing to grow, that services the momentum for capital markets. It helps the momentum on private funding. It helps for just about everything. I think legislative. It helps all of that. I think for for the industry. But I will tell you, I think the biggest thing that happened this year was that after 2017, 2018, 2019, companies like you mentioned earlier, Trulieve, GTI, there'd been all these, the conversation investment wise had always been, these are massive growth rates. We're trading on several years out revenue numbers. And the question was always, are they going to really be able to deliver on it? And I think what you've seen in the last year is you've seen, okay, that was real. That had legs. It may have taken a year longer, and there's big operations getting shut down in Canada, and it wasn't a smooth ride by any means. But I think now that people have almost a case, right, where they've seen this fully work its way through, and they've seen how these businesses could be more efficient. And then now you still have, obviously phenomenal growth potential. So I think that was a big one. That was a big validator overall on the business side. And then, the social stigmas, that's certainly, those are fading. I think as we get into cannabinoids and we start breaking the plant apart and siloing outcomes and those things, you'll see even more of those stigmas go away. But yeah, I think it was a big year on several fronts, and COVID certainly in several ways was overall was pretty helpful to cannabis, I think.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting how that works. And I remember at the beginning, before COVID hit, I was talking to someone, and I have a technology background as well, and we were talking about forming a technology reseller to focus on the cannabis space. And I remember him saying, "I don't think the opportunity is big enough." And I think it was New Frontier at the time had a prediction. I think it was by 2022 that cannabis was going to be a $24 billion a year industry. When I showed him that, it blew his mind. I'm like, this is real. This is here to stay. And this was another one that I saw. I want to say I saw it in, it was the Motley Fool put it out, and they talk about the top 10 cannabis markets in the country. You got California in this, they came out before the end of 20. So by the end of 2020 predictions, California at 3.8 billion, Colorado 1.7 billion, Michigan at 1.21. This was a huge shock to me. I posted this on LinkedIn. Florida with only 450,000 patients at 1.2 billion, Washington 1.1 billion, Nevada 960. I don't need to go through this whole list, but I mean, it's funny when we look at this industry and you talk about legislation and everything else. I had this conversation with my guest yesterday. If you describe the industry to somebody and remove the word cannabis, it would be the greatest industry on the planet. It works on social justice. It's going to have new jobs, new tax revenue, new companies, new entrepreneurs, new resources for energy and building materials and everything else. I mean, do you think that part of the reason that we're having a hard time with this industry is because it's cannabis and we're fighting an 80-year-old PR campaign against it?
I don't think I know. I mean, what you said's exactly right. The reason that got me into this is, and look, I think there are thousands of people like me, right, or smarter than me, and doing cooler things than me, that looked at cannabis and probably thought, man, there's a lot of really interesting things there, and they just didn't take that dive, probably for the reasons you're talking about, right? Or that could have been part of that. I think that's absolutely happening. But you're right. If you just laid out bullet points, a profile of an industry, and didn't give it a name, of course. I mean, you'd have every large investment firm in the world chasing the inefficiencies that exist in cannabis, the growth, the opportunities, and I mean, absolutely. And we've touched on the United States a little bit. You've got sort of the rest of the world that's a couple years behind that. So this growth story is going to continue for a while. So you're right. The profile is top notch.
So back to your point, we are 100% in the first inning of this, right? I mean, people don't realize, we look at technology and you have the leaders like Apple and Microsoft. They were founded in the 70s. You look at, bigger tech companies like Uber and Airbnb and everything else. The tech boom was in 1999, 2000. That's when the bubble burst. We didn't have Uber till what? 2012, 2015, something like that. I remember when it came about, I go, this is the greatest thing ever. But it was 15 years or 12 years after the quote unquote tech bubble. So people don't realize there was a pullback in the cannabis market. Maybe that was one, there might be another bubble, who knows? But they don't realize with these other industries how long it actually took them to reach the reputation that we see. So cannabis was legal in Colorado in 2015, California from a recreational standpoint, Colorado 2017, it's medical in most places. Then you have a state like Florida with 450,000 people representing $1.2 billion in revenue. This industry is going to be absolutely amazing. And I'm happy to see people from Wall Street coming in here and putting some normalcy to it and kind of making sure that people are taken care of. Because I think in the first iteration of cannabis companies were able to, I don't want to say print money, but they're able to raise a lot of capital because people looked at this industry like tech, right? Put a lot of money and I won't call it MedMen because I don't know what happened, but to me, from the outsider looking in, that they approached the market like a technology company as opposed to a CPG company or an agriculture company, if you will. And you look at a company like Uber where you get a massive valuation based off market share as opposed to their actual financials, right? And that just doesn't work in this space. So, it's interesting to see. And I think it's safer for investors now to have people like you doing these more traditional structures and protecting investors as well. I can see that's another advantage of bringing Wall Street into this space. I don't know your thoughts on that. I mean, I kind of do, considering I know what you do for a living, but
Well, look, I'm not blind to the fact that Wall Street screwed up plenty of things in the past, and I think the industry will have to.
Technically, you moved off Wall Street. You're on Green Street now.
I'm recovering now, right? I'm recovering Wall Street. Yeah. But no, look, Wall Street has done plenty of bad things in the past, but again, I think the marriage of sort of the folks that really know this product, know this plant, know where it comes from, know what people like, they understand those factors of it, which really does take a lot longer than a few months to learn, right? I mean, I just did my first home grow this year, and I already had a lot of respect for people who can cultivate, especially large scale and high quality product. But I'll tell you, you do it yourself a couple times, and it'll you get some dirt under your fingernails, which is good, but it'll remind you about how talented those guys are and how special they are and good at what they do, how good they are at what they do. But yeah, look, there's the marriage, I think, of sound business thinking as this industry grows up is going to be vital. So I think you're right that it is important for folks to be coming from other industries and getting involved. But again, at the end of the day, a lot of the success stories that I see, you just can't ever get too far away from having strategic thinking inside your company that really gets cannabis. It is different. It's not the same animal as everything else. It is unique and different. It's these little things that are some of it is just where the industry is and its maturity, and then other things are going to always be unique about cannabis. But you're right, we have some roadmaps out there, right? So I think you sort of know where the industry can go, and I think the science is an X factor to this. That over time you're gonna see a lot more channels that cannabis touches and ends up being very beneficial for, even than what folks are thinking about today.
Yeah. So on that note, and something that our viewers will probably hear 100 times from me and have this here, is when we talk about the cannabis market, it's so much more than just the people smoking joints. And I think from the outside in, at least the people who are uneducated, that's what they look at the recreational market, and that's what they see cannabis. They look at California. They see, comics like Sebastian Maniscalco posting the cookies dispensary with the line around the street. And that's what they view the cannabis industry as. But, when we look at it as a whole, as this industry matures, recreational cannabis is probably going to be one of the smallest parts of the industry. You're going to have medical, which would be a bigger component. When I say medical, like a true medical type of pharmaceutical area, you're going to have a very big wellness component to it. And then you have industrial hemp as well. So, when we look at this industry and people are talking about the brands and the people touching the plants, that's really phase one. And phase 2, 3, 4, 5, and beyond is going to be, what are we going to do with that raw materials when the plant itself just comes to a commodity? Is that how you're viewing the industry going forward?
Of course, right? I think new doors are going to open. To your point, phase 2, phase 3, we can sort of, at least to some extent, sort of guess what some of those might look like, or how long it takes. But then there's the next 4 or 5 that we can't even predict yet, right? That phase 2 will help us predict. I think there's just I think we're very, again, it's back to this first inning comment, right? I mean, I think we're in the first inning on a lot of levels, on, from just the way businesses, run themselves, the industry as a whole, the perception. I think we're in the first inning of how cannabis is viewed. I think all of those things are very early. But again, that's where a lot of opportunity comes from, right? You mentioned all these hurdles that people face, and it makes you. I think there's a lot of skills that come out of that. You mentioned, these folks are tough. I think you got to be mentally very tough to keep dealing with change. Trying to manage a business when the foundation that you build it on, the regulatory environment you build it on, is changing all the time. They're putting up weird hurdles in front of you, like state lines, and okay, I got to think about that. Well, I got to think about what happens when those walls come down. So it's a whole extra layer of thinking. But that's where a lot of opportunity comes, right? I mean, that's where you really get that chance to prove that you're the one who navigated it the right way. And I think we will have a lot of winners in cannabis, and I think we'll do a lot of good along the way. To your point, social justice, I think health, I think getting alternatives for opioids. There's so many ways that cannabis can be helpful. Even if you just callously say just the business aspects, getting that money coming into tax coffers. We can all joke later about how efficient the government is with our tax dollars. But the truth is, I'd sure as heck rather my state government have that money, put it towards education, than I would knowing it's going across the border somewhere to an illegal operation. So to me, there's the social experiment has been positive. There's just so many things that are tailwinds right now, and that to me, cannabis should have had a long time ago. But that's probably a different show topic. We talk about how we got here.
Oh, 100%. It's funny because I mean, I really became into cannabis only about, wait, how old am I now? All right, so 12 years ago. I wanted to say 8. Geez, I took 4 years of my own life off, right? And it's amazing to me when I first got into it, where it was this highly illegal thing. And I remember one of my first jobs, I made a president's club, and I got invited in with the executives, and they were all passing a joint. I'm like, wait, you guys smoke pot? Like, I don't have to stop in a few years. And then fast forward, it's legal in Colorado, legal in California, and then fast forward again, I'm in the industry. So coming out of nowhere, I mean, there's a lot of angry people with cannabis. I'm one of those people who takes a step back and it's like, yes, it's not where we want it to be, but look how far we've come. And yes, I haven't been there since the initial journey, like a Steve D'Angelo since the 70s and everything else. But it once we got our first rec state, the dominoes falling was absolutely incredible. So I want to talk more about
Yeah.
Ceres as well. So did you have something to add there?
Yeah, one thing I wanted that hit me the other day, or along the topic you're talking about, there are 2 and 3 year olds out there now that will never remember a world, right, where cannabis wasn't legal. And I just had my first child. She's 13 weeks old now, and it hit me the other day that she will never know a world where weed isn't. Well, what do you mean? It was, people thought that it made you crazy, or it caused you to do this, or ruined your life. I think that, and that's pretty eye-opening to think that she will literally never. I don't think she'll ever see or think about that world other than in the history books, and I think that's pretty neat.
Well, first off, congratulations. That's
Thanks.
awesome.
Thanks.
I have a 14-month-old daughter, so I'm a little bit ahead of you. And I had that same thought too. And I remember, if I'm going to continue to do this, my conversation with my daughter now is different than it would have been 5 years ago, because it is going to be a lot more socially. So remember, one of my first big interviews was, most people know him as Mike Tyson's co-host on Hot Boxing, Eben Britton. I remember talking to Eben. First of all, I didn't know he was younger than me, but he had a child. And I remember talking to Eben, like, how are you going to talk to your kids about it? And he's like, this is dad's medicine. This is what, and you got to get to a certain, just like alcohol, you got to get to a certain point in time when your brain and your body is ready to handle this. But this is something that you can use for medicine too. And I'm not saying I'm going to adopt Eben's tactics, but it's interesting where we can have these conversations about approaching our kids and telling them about this substance that we leverage and that we're involved with. And it's not a, daddy, why are you doing something illegal, or why, this is a drug or something else like that. They're going to look at it just like we look at alcohol. I mean, by the time our kids are college age, there might be cannabis commercials at the Super Bowl.
Well, I thought it was a heck of an attempt a couple of years ago that someone tried to get one in and got a lot of great publicity for being denied. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You will see a cannabis Super Bowl ad before long.
Well, you had Weed Map sponsor the Tyson fight, so that's the
Yeah,
closest that we got.
yeah, that's right.
Uh,
That's right.
so going back to Cirrus, right? So you had the private fund. Why this? So first of all, help everyone understand a SPAC real quick. Special purpose acquisition company, and why you decided to go that route. Was it for follow-on investments in the original fund? Is it so you guys can go for later stage opportunities, bigger dollar amounts? Just really understanding it. You were able to raise capital from high net worth investors. You had a fund. You're raising another fund. So I'm interested to see where the SPAC fits into that strategy.
Yeah, so on the capital side, as I said, we've been investing in the industry for several years now, and I think one of the things that we always heard over and over was, what sort of keeps you awake at night, right? And talking to these businesses, and we keep hearing, marketing and money, and the money part of that conversation always sort of became more and more heightened the bigger the business got, right? So again, back to that, sort of capital constrained on the larger checks, institutional size checks, et cetera. It's been, to your point earlier, there's been a decent amount of private capital available for, from family offices, high net worth individuals, but those 10, 20, $30 million capital raises have been much tougher, right? When you get above, call it 25 million bucks, you start sort of struggling there when those businesses get to that point, and they need that in their maturity. So for us, we saw an opportunity to do that. So that's where the SPAC fits in. Is we thought, look, this is actually a great vehicle for a cannabis company to effectively bridge some of that gap, right? To get to a place, if they're ready, they've got to obviously be ready to be a public company, and that has a whole list of changes and aspects that comes with it, right? There's a lot of positive things that come with it, but there's also a lot more work and a lot of those things that you have to deal with to be listed publicly. So for us, it was really the opportunity, and we felt like there was a real void in that sort of later stage cannabis companies, capital options. So that was one big part of it. We also saw it as an opportunity to bring together, back to the marketing side, the SPAC structure taking care of the financial piece. On the marketing side, we have partners in the SPAC, folks like you mentioned Super Bowl commercials, the ad agency 72 and Sunny. I think they had 5 or 6 Super Bowl commercials this year. They are a partner with us in the SPAC because they're, part of what they're doing is looking at, hey, we want to see what you find out there, what's going on in cannabis, because this is an industry we're going to want to be working in, and we would like some insight there. So they are with us as a partner in the SPAC. We've brought on some talent management firms back to finding some creative ways to let consumers experience cannabis in more of a traditional CPG way, right? You see, about the only way you're going to see a cannabis ad today is if you're reading a cannabis magazine, or it's on a billboard or a bus stop. There's just not that you don't see that advertising done the same way you do for Coca-Cola and everyone else, and you're not going to see that tomorrow. But what we need to do is find some creative ways to have consumers see your brand in more than one or two ways, right, on a billboard. So bringing in these talent management firms, the idea being we can have fan experience, interactions at concerts and those types of things. And I think that stuff is very important because you really do see that work in other industries in terms of CPG.
It's really cool to hear, man. And it's an interesting approach for sure. It's been a very popular approach this year. On a self-serving note, if there are any brands out there having trouble with marketing, of course, I work for Spring Big, and we'd be happy to introduce you to our new brands platform, which allows you to send text messages to the loyalty list of the dispensaries you work with. Commercial done. But yeah, honestly, we do a lot with marketing. Marketing is a huge issue, but it's interesting with the SPAC, right? Because when you do a private fund or an investment fund, you have to deal with accredited investors. With the SPAC, is that almost a way where it's like a more official GoFundMe, if you will, where you actually can have regular investors buy stock in the SPAC. And I don't want to call it crowdsourcing because it's obviously more sophisticated than that, but you can bring the general public who's interested in profiting off the cannabis space or supporting cannabis space into the space, and they don't have to be accredited investor. And it's not, it's a way for them to actually get involved. I mean, is that really a modern way of a GoFundMe where you have regulatory bodies involved?
Yeah, actually, I failed to do that. You asked that question, sort of explain how a SPAC functions. At its core, what a SPAC basically is, right, is you essentially take a shell or an empty corporation public, whereby you go out to investors that could be retail investors, like what you're referring to, sort of the general investing public, individuals that want to buy a share here or there, versus also you sort of couple that retail, right, with also being smaller institutions, or folks that can buy a public company, right? So you do actually increase the number of potential cannabis investors when you deal with a public listing, simply because now investing privately in something plant touching is a little further reach for a lot of folks than doing something public where there's an exchange, there's financials being posted, those things, right? So I think for a lot of folks, and that's sort of back to your question about why we like the SPAC structure. How it essentially works is everybody who buys your SPAC IPO, they will, in our case, we have 21 months to find a transaction, right? To find a target that we're going to purchase, and through that purchase, we'll bring them into our SPAC, and thereby they will become a public company. So we have that 21-month period. Well, the folks who bought the IPO, so somebody like yourself could have called up Canaccord, who underwrote our SPAC, and said, hey, I want to buy 50 shares of this. And for those next 20 months, you would basically hold our stock. It probably wouldn't do much, right, during a lot of that time, because there's not a lot of news until we find a target. But during that time, you earn a treasury return. So you, as an investor, are getting a free look into the deal that we bring to market, right? As the company who's involved in this transaction, so for the cannabis operator, instead of it being like a traditional IPO where they've got to sort of go out to the market and say, hey, here's what we're worth, buy our stock at this price, et cetera. In this case, they get to sort of sit alongside of us and sort of behind closed doors negotiate a lot of those pieces, because the shareholders are there. So it changes the dynamic of becoming public. And that's what I really like, because it allows both sides, the investors and the cannabis companies, to weigh towards each other, which I think helps close some of that risk and uncertainty about an industry that's high flying. But I've heard stories of illegal activity. I'm scared of it. This, to me, that helps alleviate a lot of that. So I think that's what you're doing with a SPAC structure, is you're bringing those two sides a little closer together and making that leap easier for both of them. And I think that's a big part of this.
Yeah, I really like that model. I'm learning more about it this year as they're becoming more and more popular, and bringing, I don't know, kind of the average Joe into it, because there are a lot of people who want to take advantage of this market, and they can't because they don't have the money, they're not accredited, but they understand cannabis and they understand the space, and they might buy public stocks and everything else, but now they have the ability to invest in cannabis. It's interesting when you raise a private fund, and most of the time you're at least in cannabis, you're going to ultra high net worth individuals, or you're going to family offices. And what people don't understand is, when you're raising capital from an institutional investor, that's a job of theirs, right? So when they have X amount of dollars that they need to invest, they have to invest it. It's part of their job to invest that money. When you go to a family office, that's the family's money. People don't realize that they always have an option to not invest that money. It's not that they don't want to invest in you or they like somebody better than you. They do have an option of, we just don't have to make an investment. And families, I've been in the family office world for a little bit, and any family office will tell you they would rather not lose money, or they'd rather not make money than lose money, right? So it's interesting to see that. And I think you have, I want to say, more supportive investors that are going to be, and I can say this, you don't have to, less pain in the ass to you too. So it's a really interesting tactic that you're taking. You don't have to back that up. I'm sure your investors are absolutely amazing, but I've raised capital before. I know how it can be. Yeah, we lost your sound there for a second.
Mute. It is different investor bases, no question. And you're absolutely right. There's good and bad about both. Of course, there's positives and negatives to both structures. I think in terms of what you deal with there, because look, we as a SPAC, we go through quarterly financial reporting. You don't have to do a lot of that as a private company. So, there's difficulties, there's positives and negatives to it for sure. And the investor bases, to your point, are very different.
Yeah. So you've got these vehicles. You're looking at opportunities. You listen on the Canadian exchange because you want to look at plant touching companies. What are you looking at now? Are you looking at companies that are taking a very medical approach and starting to break down the plant into the different parts? Are you looking for people who really understand branding and are going to be an awesome CPG company? What types of organizations are you looking at? And it's funny, I told you I was listening to a podcast that you did earlier than this, and I really like what you said, that you want to look at plant touching companies because they're the core of the industry. I remember when, a few years ago, you saw a lot of funds that were only investing in the ancillary part of the industry. And a thought in my head said, well, if no one's investing in the plant touching, those ancillary companies are going to have no one to work with, right? So I really like the strategy, but I'm interested in when you're looking at something that's eventually going to be commoditized, what you're looking for in an organization from either a rec standpoint or a medical standpoint, and really where you're seeing opportunities.
Yeah. So with the SPAC, the main focus for us is what traditionally people call the MSOs, right? With certainly a sort of CPG bend to all of that. So we are looking at vertically integrated, multi-state or deep single state, vertically integrated operators. So certainly need or have a branding and CPG component to that. I mean, that is part of our general thesis, is that the consumerification of cannabis is coming. As the consumer gets more educated, demands better products, the science, to your point, gets over here, and all of a sudden now you've got specific products geared at specific ailments, and you've got the recreational side, so you have the sort of traditional CPG aspects. I think there's going to be a lot of different angles there, but generally I call it sort of consumerification, and so that is a big piece of it. I think you're right when you get into commoditizing cannabis. That's something you certainly have to think about, and regulatory structure is obviously the name of that game. If you it's a very different situation in California than what it is in Florida, right? So just two very different setups, and you sort of, to your point, you in some places you've got to be vertically integrated. In other places, maybe it makes sense not to be, or certain parts of that supply chain to not do business in. So it's a little different everywhere, and that's back to your point earlier about the challenges in the industry, right? And I think if you're going to do plant touching, and I do believe it's the core of the industry, and I still think when there's that many opportunities in the core of the industry, then why go ancillary yet, right? Other than it's simpler and makes and feels like an easier thing to understand. That might be true, and you don't want to deal with those headaches, but if you're willing to deal with those headaches, I still believe the opportunity there is basically second to none. I mean, picks and shovels is always what you hear, right? When you hear of ancillary, folks say, "Oh, I'm into picks and shovels." Well, that's great, but if there was no gold, to your point, picks and
Yeah.
shovels wouldn't have mattered very much. And I think we've until the gold is found, until we find some gold, it's hard to sell a lot of picks and shovels, right? And so as the industry, I think as that core piece of the industry does better, then you will have better and better ancillary businesses that are able to service that better, do a better job there, et cetera. And that'll lift all those boats.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as there are no true national brands yet, there are brands that are starting to become that, and they're doing licensing deals. It's almost the same with the ancillary companies, where there are very few companies that are universal across the cannabis space. I think a lot of them are regional, depending on when the state came online and how they attack that specific state. I mean, you look at the technologies that they're using, the different seed to sale tracking softwares. There are market leaders, but nobody has a significant market share. You look at the law firms, the accounting firms. There's no universal. If you're in cannabis, you use X, Y, or Z, right? So it's interesting too when people are focused on the ancillary part. I think we need to see the maturity of the core business in order to see the next big ancillary company that's going to become the de facto standard in cannabis on an ancillary standpoint. So it's very interesting to me, and I love the fact that you're focusing on the main asset of this industry, which are the plant touching companies, because they do need capital. By them growing, that's going to bring up the ancillary part of this industry, and that's how we're going to move forward. To me, I just give you so much credit in the world because I've done that, and I've looked at a lot of pitch decks, and the amount of people who, grew the best product or had the best process and everything else, they all do. And after a while, 95% of their decks start to look the same. And at that point, it's really, you sit down with the management team and it's like, okay, are you bullshitting? Is it real? It's really interesting. So I give you all the credit in the world. I'm assuming that's where your partners come in as far as helping you evaluate the cannabis side and the management team, and differentiating from, everybody who says they've got the gas, if you will.
No, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I was going to say that's where my partner Mike Vukmanovich, we call him Vuk. That's where he comes in. Is this guy says he's won 27 cannabis cups? Everybody's won 27 cannabis cups. Why do you think he's better? Look at his product. Tell me what you think. Look at his worst product and tell me what you think. That type of stuff I think is a very, very helpful guide into your sort of the BS factor, right? And understand,
Yeah.
because that's some of those inefficiencies that we still deal with, right? There aren't a lot of certification systems, right? Everybody calls themselves a master grower. Well, that's defined very, very differently from a lot of different conversations I've had, right? If you've completed one small grow, there's people who call themselves a master grower. And then there's folks that have completed massive operations for years, and they use the same title. And those two folks are not obviously the same. So I think there's a lot of that stuff you have to sort of be able to wade through, some of that, I think, to really figure out who to do business with. And look, that's the jury's still out, frankly, on a lot of folks we think are the right people. We'll see, hopefully, and we certainly still believe that they are, but time will tell, because there will be winners, and there will definitely be some some glorious losers as well as this thing matures and goes forward.
Oh, it's funny when you say master grower. I think a lot of companies don't realize that at some point the master grower isn't going to be the main person growing. At some point, the master grower is going to be overseeing everybody else. I mean, I always make the joke when you look at these big, massive chain restaurants, at some point they had to be good, right? And nothing against chain restaurants, but you go to the Cheesecake Factory, you know what you're going to get. It's going to be right down the middle, bland chain restaurant food. But at some point, when they had that first restaurant, I'm sure the food was amazing, and that warranted getting as big as they were, right? And it's going to be the same thing with cannabis. At some point, can your master grower be in charge of a team of growers, right? And as opposed to being the one who grows it themselves. And then it's interesting. This is the example I always use, and we don't have the graphics split up, but Lowell in California, right? It's a pre-roll pack, and this is what they became huge on. And nothing against Lowell, I'm a big fan of the company, but I always, when I talk to a lot of companies like, oh, we have the best, the reputation sells and everything else, I always go, Lowell didn't become the biggest company, one of the biggest companies in California, because they had the best product. It was their branding, it was their story. It's this beautiful packaging that they have, and it's really cool to start seeing a lot of cannabis companies take that to heart and really build a brand. And not everybody just trying to build the straight down the middle cannabis lifestyle brand. You have companies like Pop and Barkley and Candescent that are taking a different approach, and there's still a space for the traditional lifestyle in this industry. It's what was built off of, but there's also the general public that we need to target. So I'm going on this rant. I'm not sure what the point of it is, but it's just such, I do that a lot on the show. It's just such an interesting space that I give you so much credit having the ability to make these decisions on where to put money, just because there is so much similar to each other in this space, right? So we've talked about 2020, COVID. It was a big, impactful year. It was supposed to be a very big year for M&A. As of the past few months, we're starting to see some of that. AltMed and Verano, I think it was someone else got acquired recently too. I think it was from AYR. So there's a lot of we're starting to see that. The year that we thought 2020 was going to be, are we going to see that in 2021? Are we going to see, and this might be part of your strategy, where I've always said the MSOs of tomorrow are the ones that focus on their state, grew in their state, focused on becoming profitable. And at that point, they start moving into other states to replicate what they've been doing in the state. What we're also seeing is people acquiring to become MSOs. Is that going to be the trend that we're going to see going forward in 2021? Is this going to be the year of consolidation?
Look, I think so, and I don't even necessarily think it's going to be confined to 2021. I think it'll bleed into 2022 because I think it started very late this year, right? And I think you're just sort of starting, to scratch the surface of that. Obviously the couple of there have been several even cannabis Spac related deals announced, and then your point, Verano Altmed, very large deal. There's been Clever Leaves in South America. There's several transactions that I think are pointing to the idea that there are going to be, and there's even been a lot of small deals, right? Ascend purchasing a couple of dispensaries recently in Illinois. I think you're going to see a lot of that continue. And I actually think it's a little bit I think it's a healthy medium between what you saw a lot of folks do, which was go out and such a large land grab that I think most folks would sort of say you got out a little out over your skis, and you didn't have the money to build out on all this, and it's sort of, you weren't doing anything well because you were trying to do too much. And then there were folks, right, that really did exactly what you said. They really focused at home, really did it right in a smaller area. I actually think the ideal, and this is hindsight's 2020, right? Looking back, the ideal way to do it would be, stretch out a little bit, right? Get a little bit of footprint, because that footprint is going to matter, right? You see the folks that really focused at home, they're now extending their legs, right? And I think that's to your point, a fine path to take. Door number one didn't work, right? There were a lot of sort of victims of, we have 30 licenses, we're in 9 states, but really we're not doing any states well. And I think that was a story for sure, and a lesson learned, I think, for a lot of folks. And look, the truth is we'll see it again, right? There'll be more stories like that, because there is a lot of allure and a shiny object when a new state comes online, or when you start to really think this state's going to turn over. I want to get over there and I want to be there quick. But I think you're right. Really focusing on what you do well and where you do it well. Do that first, and but then start to extend yourself a little bit, because I do think there's a lot of things that's going to come with that footprint over time. That's where you open up more opportunities for CPG and branding, and actually being able to transfer that IP to more geographies. I think that's something we're going to get into. And you're just sort of starting to see that, right? Where brands that are in Florida, you're starting to see them in other places, California bleeding into Nevada and Arizona. And I think you will start to see more and more of that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see brands starting to take a foothold in Florida, because, to do business in Florida, you're essentially partnering with one of our vertically integrated MSOs, and you're just passing off your SOPs. You're not really using your product. I mean, with the edibles companies, yeah, you can bring in your suppliers of cocoa and everything else like that, but you're not the cannabis, right? Not the number one ingredient. But then you take a step back and you realize that this state has the potential to go wreck in 2022, and they're just making a foothold in the state to be here before everybody else can come in. But it doesn't mean to me, and I'm nothing against these brands, but it doesn't mean shit until they break up vertical integration. Like, listen, you have an edibles companies, partnering with one of our MSOs. I hate saying it. That's the MSO's product with your name on it, and nothing against those companies. I see where they're coming from, getting ready for legalization, whether it happens at the state level or the federal level. So it's interesting to see that. But on that point, the last thing I want to let you, because I've had you on the phone for an hour already, or Zoom, whatever the hell we're doing here. So I want to let you get back. But what is the best path to federal legalization here? And I'm curious to know this, because as time has gone on, and especially with this year with the political polarization and everything, I think federal legalization scares the shit out of me, because I don't know if they're going to handle it correctly. Right? I would love to see it open up federally. I'd love to see it cross state lines and everything else like that. But I don't think there's a single state that we can point to and say they have it 100% right. What we do have is 38, 39 some odd case studies, and we have the opportunity to take the best from everywhere. But obviously at the federal level, there's going to be a lot of self-interest involved and everything else like that. And I really see them messing up some of the things that we've accomplished in this industry already. So is the better path to legalization the federal government just saying somehow, hey, it's legal, but the states are going to regulate it for the next some odd years or whatever else? Or is it just let the federal government handle it, regulate it? Because the only downside to the way that I see it is I would love to see our country be able to import and become the world leader in export and become the world leader in cannabis. And really, I think that's going to truly help our economy. So I know there's a lot there and it's a very loaded question, but I'd really be interested to understand where you see the perfect path or, your assumed perfect path to federal legalization.
I might be reading into what you were saying too much, but if I'm wrong, I can lead. I can go then into what I believe here, which I think sort of folds into that, which is I think it would be a little bit dangerous, if you will, right now for there to be actually a federal legalization move. Because I think you're right. There's been so far it's not been. We don't really know how to do it at that type of scale yet, right? We haven't figured it out yet. To your point, we haven't figured it out yet at most state levels or any state level, really. If everybody sort of has something they didn't do well, didn't implement well, right? And so I think we do still have some lessons to learn there, and I think it's healthier long term if we step our way into that, a little bit slower. And because I think a lot of things are going to change as soon as you get federal legalization. And I also I don't necessarily think you're even really going to necessarily ever see the federal government try to legalize. I think they decriminalize and obviously reschedule, but effectively saying, look, just like alcohol, this is really a state issue. States can decide what they want to do. Within states, counties can decide what they want to do. I think, I think that's probably a much more likely outcome, at least for the foreseeable future, versus there being anything mandated sort of from a federal level. But I agree, borders opening up. I think we're still years away from that. But I think there's going to be a really interesting play for folks, like I think what you're alluding to, Northern California, right? Marketed product from Humboldt, going to places abroad. I think there will definitely be a market for that. And then there'll be the low cost producers in South America that are producing at scale, that potentially are importing product here, more budget friendly and import product here. So who knows, right? I think there's a lot of ways that could work its way through. But to me, I think it really should be a state issue and sort of handled a little bit like alcohol is, where the states can sort of decide. I think then the federal government at some point when it comes to interstate commerce may have to get involved and figure some of those things out. But I think it would be better if we move a little bit slower. We're moving fast enough by adding so many states. And I think you could see several more states come online this year. And that's without voters even going to the polls. So I think we've got a lot of growth coming, whether the federal government does much of anything. I personally would love to see the federal government first make banking and some of those typical business functions more acceptable, or more accessible, I mean. That to me is the first right step. Decriminalization and dealing with folks that are sitting in jail for cannabis is certainly right up there at the very top of that list as well. But I think there's a lot of things they have to do federal legalization well, and I don't know that we're fully ready for that yet. But I do think we're headed in a direction that generally gets us there.
No, I agree with you. And it's funny, you talk about, the folks sitting in jail, and just something clicked in my head that for some reason, when we do it at a state level, I don't see the opposition really being able to take the narrative of quote unquote letting criminals out of jail, right? You hear that and you see it, but the voices are very low. They're not very loud. And my fear is when we look at it at the federal level, that narrative is going to get twisted and it's going to hit the major media outlets. And, hey, they want to let drug dealers out of jail and everything else like that. And those are the things that kind of scare me, because we know that we're letting out, that we're looking for the nonviolent offenders, right? If you were a drug dealer and you killed somebody, you're still a murderer. We're not letting you out, right? But if you got arrested for having a half ounce of weed on you, you don't deserve to be sitting there, and you don't deserve to be sitting there for as long as you have been. So,
Right.
I think when we do it incrementally, the opposition doesn't have the power, and they can't get, at the end of the day, the internet let all the crazy people meet each other. And that's the reason where we see some of this come from, right? So listen, Joe, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend with us. This has been an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it. Before we let you go, let's let you get any of the plugs or anything else you want to put out there.
No, look, I think we touched on a lot of the things that folks ought to be thinking about right now, right? Pay attention to the SPACs. I do think it'll be a very big M&A year. I think there'll be I think there'll be a lot of success stories this year, a lot of really good news in cannabis. Though like Cannabis has done in the past, there'll be a couple of black eyes that show up somewhere along the way as well, most likely. But look, I think we're moving in the right direction. I'm really happy to see that investors are, back looking at cannabis and feeling like, hey, this is a place to put money. I think that's important. The trickle down through the entire industry, I think that's very important. So yeah, if you're if you're looking to invest money, I absolutely would suggest spending time and looking at cannabis. And I think there's a lot of good opportunities there.
That's awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. I agree with those sentiments. Thank you so much for joining. Of course, folks, I mean, you can invest in cannabis podcasts as well, too. Obviously, I kid. But Joe, thank you so much for the show. As you spend your 120 million, and I say that jokingly, we'd love to have you back, talk about some of the moves you make, and just see what you're doing this year, man. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. Let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody at home. Like I said, February 6th, check it out, jointclab.com, annual C-Lab conference. We're live tomorrow. We're going to be a little bit earlier tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern for our regular episode with Mike McDonald, the inventor of the Dablicator. And then at 1 p.m. Eastern, we are coming to you with a special episode. My friends, Emily and Morgan Paxia from Poseidon Partners are going to be joining us for our 2020 year in review. Should be awesome. That's going to be right here at facebook.com/Cannabis Group. Of course, if you missed any part of this interview and you want to catch up, A, just hit the rewind button, but B, it'll be live on our YouTube next week at youtube.com/Elevate Your Grind. This has been another episode of Elevate Your Grind. We'll see you tomorrow for our last shows of the year. Take care, everybody.